At 11:47 p.m. on December 17, 1944, Corporal Thomas Lyle sat hunched over a damaged Torn FUD-2 radio set in a half-collapsed barn outside Malmedy, Belgium, listening to German Panzer commanders coordinate an advance that would overrun his entire division by dawn. The radio wasn't his. It had been pulled from a burning Wehrmacht half-track 3 hours earlier. The frequencies were enemy channels, strictly forbidden for Allied use. The device still worked. Barely. Static crackled through the headset, but underneath it, clear as ice, German voices. Lyle had been a signals operator for 11 months. He knew radio protocols inside and out. Frequency ranges, encryption patterns, call sign rotations. He spoke German fluently. His grandparents were from Bavaria. He'd trained as a translator before being reassigned to communications. But the Allied radio network had one fatal problem that was getting American soldiers killed every single day. It was shattered. German armor moved fast, hit hard, and overran positions before intel could flow back up the chain. Allied units were scattered across frozen forests with no way to coordinate, no way to call for artillery, no way to warn each other. The Germans, meanwhile, were in constant radio contact. Panzergruppe West coordinating columns like a symphony. American doctrine was clear. Maintain radio silence unless authorized by battalion command. No improvisation. No unsanctioned broadcasts. Wait for orders. Follow the chain. Lyle had followed that doctrine for 3 days. It hadn't worked. In the past 72 hours, the 106th Infantry Division had lost nearly 8,000 men, most of them overrun in isolated pockets, cut off, calling for help that never came. Lyle had monitored their final transmissions. Desperate voices asking for coordinates, for reinforcements, for anyone. Then silence. Good men. Kids, really. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Pennsylvania. They climbed into frozen foxholes trusting that someone, somewhere, was watching their flank. But no one was. The network was blind. The operations officer said the problem was German speed. The battalion commander said it was weather. The snow disrupted line-of-sight communications. The manual said units should fall back to rally points and re-establish contact. But Lyle knew better. The problem wasn't the radios. It was that the Allies were reacting while the Germans were directing. The Wehrmacht had central coordination. Every Panzer unit received updated orders in real time. They moved like a machine, synchronized, efficient, unstoppable. The Allies, scattered and silent, were fighting blind. Lyle had suggested this to his CO 2 days ago. What if they intercepted German traffic and fed it to division intel? The officer said signals intelligence required clearance from Chef, and Chef was 200 miles away in Luxembourg. Besides, no field operator had authorization to monitor enemy frequencies without a G2 liaison present. That required approval from Theater Command, and Theater Command had already declared this sector lost. So Lyle did something that violated every regulation in the U.S. Army Signal Corps Field Manual. He tuned the captured German radio to Panzergruppe West's primary command frequency, adjusted the transmission gain to match Wehrmacht signal strength, cleared his throat, and in flawless Hochdeutsch keyed the mic. Achtung! Alle Einheiten, Panzergruppe West. Halten Sie die aktuelle Linie. Warten auf neue Befehle. Ende. Attention! All units, Panzergruppe West. Hold the current line. Await new orders. Over. The modification took 11 seconds. It added 0 equipment. It eliminated Allied disadvantage completely. Nobody noticed. No Allied unit was monitoring that frequency. No German operator questioned the voice. It used proper call sign structure, correct phrasing, command tone. Lyle released the transmit key, set the radio down, and waited. What happened in the next 6 hours would stall an entire armored division and buy the Allies time they shouldn't have had. The first Allied position Lyle heard fall was 2nd Platoon, Baker Company. December 16th, 03:40 hours. 23 men dug in along a ridgeline south of Losheim. Lyle had been monitoring their freck since midnight. They were green. Most had been in country less than a month. Their radio operator, a private named Castellano, had a thick Bronx accent and kept asking if anyone had extra batteries. At 03:40, Castellano's voice cut through the static, high and fast. "Contact front. Armor moving up the road. We got... Oh, Jesus, there's..." Then the frequency went dead. Lyle tried to raise them. Nothing. He switched to battalion command to relay. The net was jammed with traffic. Everyone shouting over everyone. No one could confirm positions. No one knew where the German line actually was. By the time anyone responded, the 2nd Platoon was gone. Lyle found out later that Castellano had survived. He'd been captured along with 9 others. The rest were killed when 2 Panzer IVs rolled straight through their line. The after-action report said they'd been overwhelmed by superior force. But Lyle knew what had really happened. They'd never had a chance to call for artillery. By the time anyone knew they were hit, the Germans were already 2 miles past them. 4 days later, it happened again. The radio was still warm when Lyle pulled it from the half-track. December 17th, 18:30 hours, 2 miles south of Malmedy. The Wehrmacht vehicle had taken a direct hit from a bazooka team. The front cab collapsed, the driver slumped over the wheel, but the rear compartment was mostly intact. Lyle had been retreating with a scattered group of stragglers when they'd passed the wreckage. Most of the men kept moving. Lyle stopped. He recognized the antenna configuration. Torn FUD-2, German medium-range transceiver. The casing was dented, the frequency dial cracked, but when he checked the battery terminals, they were clean. No corrosion. No obvious damage to the tube housing. It might still work. He yanked it free, tucked it under his coat, and kept walking. By 2100 hours, he was alone in a barn 3 kilometers west. And the radio was talking. Not to him, around him. He'd powered it on just to test functionality. The speaker crackled. Then voices emerged. Clear, clipped, efficient. German unit commanders coordinating movement. Panzer columns requesting fuel status. Reconnaissance teams reporting Allied positions. It was a complete operational picture. The entire German offensive flowing through his headset in real time. Lyle sat in the frozen dark and listened. And slowly, an idea formed. Terrible, dangerous, impossible to ignore. The regulation was unambiguous. Unauthorized use of enemy equipment constituted a court-martial offense. Section 4.7 of the Signal Corps Field Manual. He'd memorized it during training. Intercepting enemy transmissions required G2 clearance. Transmitting on enemy frequencies was strictly prohibited under any circumstance. Violators faced military tribunal, dishonorable discharge, prison time. But sitting here, listening to the Germans coordinate with perfect clarity while Allied units died in isolation, Lyle felt something harden in his chest. What was the point of following regulations if it meant losing the war? He thought about Castellano, about 2nd Platoon, about the voices he'd heard go silent over the past 3 days. Good men calling for help that never came because the system was broken, and nobody with the authority to fix it was close enough to see it breaking. Battalion command was gone. The division was scattered. Schaeff was 200 miles away, probably looking at maps that were already 12 hours out of date. Nobody was coming to save them. Which meant if someone didn't do something, right now, tonight, the entire sector would collapse. Lyle stared at the radio. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the weight of what he was considering. If he transmitted on this frequency, he could be shot. If he impersonated a Wehrmacht officer, it was espionage, a bullet or a noose, no trial necessary. But if he did nothing, thousands dead. The line broke. The Germans pushed west unopposed. He thought about the manual. Then he thought about Castellano's last transmission. Contact front. Armor. Oh, Jesus. Lyle reached for the microphone. His finger hovered over the transmit key. One press. That's all it would take. One sentence in German, and he'd either stop the advance or end his own life. Fear told him to wait, to find an officer, to follow protocol. But protocol had killed the 2nd Platoon. And protocol wouldn't stop the panzers rolling through the snow 12 kilometers east. So Lyle made a choice. He adjusted the frequency dial to match the command channel he'd been monitoring, cleared his throat, composed the sentence in his head, proper syntax, correct military phrasing, command tone. Then he pressed the key and spoke. Achtung! Alle Einheiten! Panzergruppe West! Halten Sie die aktuelle Linie! Warten auf neue Befehle! Ende! Attention! All units, Panzergruppe West, hold the current line. Await new orders. Over. Lyle released the transmit key. Silence. Then static. Then a voice, sharp, questioning. Wiederholen Sie? Wer spricht? Repeat. Who is speaking? Lyle's heart slammed against his ribs. His hand was slick with sweat on the microphone. He had maybe 3 seconds to respond before they dismissed it as interference or, worse, recognized it as enemy action. He clicked the transmit key again, kept his voice level, command tone, annoyed, not uncertain. Funkleitstelle, Sektor Vier. Befehl vom Oberkommando. Bestätigen Sie Empfang. Communications Control. Sektor Hor. Order from High Command. Confirm receipt. A pause. 2 seconds. 3. Then, Verstanden. Empfang bestätigt. Understood. Receipt confirmed. It worked. Lyle's breath came out in a shudder. He set the mic down, hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped it. They believed him. 1 unit at least. But 1 wasn't enough. He needed more. Needed to spread the confusion wide enough that it couldn't be easily corrected. He switched frequencies, monitoring the regimental command channel now. German voices overlapped, coordinating convoy routes, fuel deliveries, forward reconnaissance. A panzer commander was requesting permission to advance past grid reference TK7739. Lyle waited until the request repeated. Then he keyed in. Negative. TK7739 unter Artilleriefeuer. Halten Sie die Position bis 02 Uhr. Negative. TK7739 under artillery fire. Hold position until 2200 hours. Silence. Then, Verstanden? Halten position. Understood. Holding position. The effect rippled outward like cracks in ice. Lyle monitored 3 frequencies simultaneously now, headset pressed tight against his ear. German chatter filled the barn. Overlapping voices, requests for clarification, units asking for updated maps. A supply convoy reported conflicting route orders. A reconnaissance team requested confirmation on forward positions. A Panzer battalion commander, voice tight with frustration, demanded to know why his advance clearance had been rescinded. Lyle answered each one. Calm, authoritative, never hesitating. He invented grid references, cited non-existent artillery threats, referenced updated intelligence from Oberkommando that required immediate holds on all forward movement pending reassessment. His German was flawless, his phrasing textbook. His call sign rotation mimicked standard Wehrmacht protocol. And with every transmission, the German advance slowed. But the strain was crushing. Sweat ran down Lyle's back despite the freezing air. His heart hammered so loud he could barely hear the radio. Every time he pressed the transmit key, he expected someone to challenge him, to demand authentication codes he didn't have, to recognize the voice as foreign, to trace the signal back to this barn and send a team to execute him on the spot. But they didn't. Because in the chaos of a multi-division offensive, with dozens of units transmitting simultaneously, nobody questioned a confident voice issuing tactically sound orders. The Germans trusted their own system, and Lyle was using that trust like a weapon. At 2147 hours, a Panzerhauptmann, captain, broke through on the priority channel. Achtung, Funkleitstelle! Ich habe widersprüchliche Befehle von 3 verschiedenen Quellen. Anforderung zur Klärung. Sofort! Attention, Communications Control. I have contradictory orders from 3 different sources. Request clarification. Immediately. Lyle's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment someone with enough authority noticed the inconsistencies. If he didn't answer correctly, if he hesitated, if he fumbled the response, the entire deception would collapse. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and pressed the key. Hauptmann, Kommunikationsstörung durch feindliche Störsender. Alle Einheiten halten aktuelle Positionen bis Klärung erfolgt. Keine eigenmächtige Bewegung. Funkleitstelle Ende. Captain, communication interference from enemy jamming. All units, hold current positions until clarification received. No independent movement. Communications control, out. He released the key, held his breath. The response came through 10 seconds later. Verstanden. Halte position. Understood. Holding position. Lyle sat back against the frozen barn wall, shaking. Outside, somewhere in the dark forest to the east, Panzer engines idled, waiting for orders that would never come. From a command structure that didn't know he existed. 14 kilometers east, inside a SDKFZ 251 command half-track, Oberstleutnant Friedrich Vogel was losing control of his map. It kept sliding off the makeshift table, a sheet of plywood balanced across ammunition crates, every time his radio operator leaned forward to adjust frequencies. Vogel slammed his palm down on the paper, holding it flat, his other hand gripping a red grease pencil that had stopped making sense 20 minutes ago. 3 different movement orders, 3 different sources, all contradictory. His Panzer battalion had been cleared to advance to grid TK7739 at 20:30 hours. Then, at 2115, Communications Control ordered a hold, citing artillery danger. At 21:32, his regimental commander, via motorcycle courier, not radio, demanded to know why his tanks weren't moving. Vogel looked at his Hauptmann, Werner Steiners, who was hunched over the radio receiver, headset clamped to one ear. Steiner, Klärung, jetzt. Steiner, clarification, now. Steiner shook his head, frustrated. Herr Oberstleutnant, I have Kampfgruppe Nord reporting the same issue. Contradictory hold orders on multiple channels. They're requesting, I don't care what they're requesting. I need to know if we advance or if we sit here freezing while the Americans regroup. Steiner hesitated. Communications Control says enemy jamming is causing interference. Vogel's jaw tightened. Then get me a direct line to the division command. Not control. Division. I've tried, sir. The line's saturated. Every unit is asking the same question. Vogel stared at the map. His battalion, 42 tanks, 600 men, sat motionless in a forest clearing, engines idling. Burning fuel they couldn't replace easily. To the north, Kampfgruppe Nord was stalled. To the south, the reconnaissance screen had halted pending clarification. An entire division frozen, and nobody could explain why. Back in the barn, Lyle's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd been monitoring the command frequencies for the past 30 minutes, listening to the chaos spread. Units requesting clarification. Officers demanding authentication. Convoy commanders asking for updated routes. And every few minutes, another voice, calm, authoritative, his own. feeding them just enough instruction to keep them hesitating. He hadn't expected this. He'd hoped to stall one unit, maybe two, buy an hour, perhaps, for Allied forces to reposition. But this was an entire operational collapse. He switched to the regimental frequency. A panzer commander was reporting fuel status, asking if the hold order was still active. Another unit broke in, asking the same question. Then another. Lyle's breath fogged in the frozen air. His finger hovered over the transmit key. He pressed it. Alle Einheiten, Befehl bleibt bestehen. Keine Bewegung bis 2:30 Uhr. Funkleitstelle Ende. All units. Order remains in effect. No movement until 0200 hours. Communications control out. A chorus of acknowledgments crackled through the speaker. Verstanden! 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 Lyle released the key and sat back, staring at the radio like it had just caught fire. They were listening to him. Not just one company, not just one battalion. An entire panzer division. Thousands of men. Hundreds of vehicles. Obeying orders from a corporal sitting in a frozen barn with a stolen radio. Inside Vogel's half-track, Steiner looked up from the receiver. Sir, communications control confirms hold until 0200 hours. All units. Vogel's knuckles whitened around the grease pencil. On whose authority? Oberkommando, sir. Transmitted via Funkleitstelle. I want verification. Direct contact with... Sir, every channel is reporting the same order. It's consistent across the network. Vogel stared at the map. The red lines marking his advance routes suddenly looked like scars. He'd been a panzer officer for 3 years. Fought in Poland, France, Russia. He knew momentum. Knew that in armored warfare, hesitation was death. And right now, his entire division was hesitating. He could override the order. Push forward on his own authority. But if communications control was right, if there was enemy artillery ahead, if intelligence had shifted, he'd be sending his men into a kill zone. But if the order was wrong, if it was interference, confusion, a communications failure, then every minute he waited was a minute the Americans used to dig in. He had no way to know which. Vogel exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold. We hold until 2200, but I want scouts forward. Foot patrol. Confirm enemy positions without radio contact. If they find nothing, we move regardless of what communication says. Steiner nodded. Jawohl, Herr Oberstleutnant. Lyle heard the scout order go out 20 minutes later. His stomach twisted. They were adapting, questioning. The deception had a shelf life, and it was shrinking fast. But he checked his watch. 22:19 hours. He'd bought them in 3 hours, maybe 4 if he could stretch it. 4 hours for Allied forces to regroup, to reposition artillery, to reinforce the line. 4 hours created by nothing but a voice in the dark. Lyle gripped the microphone, his frozen fingers aching, and kept talking. Lyle kept transmitting until 0143 hours. By then, his voice was hoarse, his throat raw from speaking German in the command register for nearly 4 hours straight. The radio's battery was dying, transmission strength dropping, static creeping into every frequency. He'd cycled through every variation he could think of. Hold orders, route changes, fuel priority redirections, weather warnings, requests for reconnaissance confirmation before advance, anything to keep them waiting. And they had waited. Through his headset, he'd listened to the German advance grind to a near halt. Panzer columns idling. Supply convoys rerouted twice, then 3 times. Company commanders demanded clarification that never came. Then, at 0151 hours, Lyle heard something that made his chest tighten. American artillery, distant, to the west, but coordinated. A rolling barrage that meant forward observers, fire direction centers, communication networks functioning again. It meant the Allied line was reforming. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. The deep crump of impact, the rhythm of guns that had found their range. It had worked. He'd bought them enough time. At 2:03 hours, Lyle dismantled the radio. Not carefully. Not like a trained operator preserving equipment for intelligence analysis. He smashed it, yanked the vacuum tubes and crushed them under his boot heel, ripped the wiring harness free and scattered the pieces across the barn floor. Took the frequency crystal, the component that would prove which channels he'd been transmitting on, and threw it into the snow outside, where it disappeared into the dark. The microphone went into the fire pit, along with the headset. He watched them melt, rubber and bakelite curling into black smoke. When he was finished, there was nothing left but scrap metal and burnt wire. Nothing that could be traced. Nothing that could identify what he'd done or how he'd done it. He kicked snow over the ashes. Then he slung his rifle, turned west, and started walking. Lyle reached Allied lines at 0640 hours on December 18th. A mixed group, stragglers from the 99th Division, a few engineers, a lieutenant who'd lost his entire platoon. They'd rallied at a crossroads 5 kilometers west of Malmedy, digging in behind hastily positioned anti-tank guns. Nobody asked where Lyle had been. Nobody asked what he'd been doing. In the chaos of a collapsing front, one signal corporal appearing out of the snow was unremarkable. He reported to the senior NCO, a master sergeant who barely looked up from a map. "You operational, Corporal?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Radio experience?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Good. We need someone on Battalion Frarek. Equipment's in the basement. Get it working." Lyle nodded, descended the stairs, and spent the rest of the day repairing a damaged SCR-300, his hands steady, his mind blank. Nobody asked about German radio. Nobody knew. 3 weeks later, a signals intelligence team from Kiev analyzed, captured Wehrmacht communication logs recovered near Malmedy. The report, filed on January 9, 1945, noted several anomalies in Panzergruppe West transmissions during the night of December 17-18. Multiple units reported contradictory movement orders originating from an unidentified source using proper call sign structure and authentication protocol. German after-action reports cite communication interference and enemy jamming as contributing factors to delayed advance in Sector 4. Analysis suggests possible equipment malfunction or unauthorized transmission within the German command network. No Allied deception operation planned or authorized for this time period. Recommend further investigation if additional intercepts become available. The report was stamped low priority and filed in a storage depot in London. No further investigation was conducted. Lyle never spoke about what he'd done. Not to the master sergeant, not to the officers who reorganized his unit after the line stabilized, not to the replacements who arrived in January, asking what the Battle of the Bulge had been like. He fixed radios, monitored frequencies, relayed messages. When the war ended, he went home to Wisconsin, worked at a hardware store, married a schoolteacher named Mary, and raised 3 children who never knew their father had once stopped a Panzer division with nothing but a voice and a lie. The German radio stayed buried under snow and ash in a collapsed barn outside Malmedy, and Corporal Thomas Lyle became what he'd always been. Just another soldier, one among millions, unremarked, unremembered, until the logs were declassified 60 years later, and someone finally asked the right question. The truth surfaced in 2004, buried in a footnote. A graduate student at the University of Maryland, researching Wehrmacht communication protocols for her dissertation, was cross-referencing declassified SHAEF intelligence reports with captured German unit logs from the Ardennes offensive. She found the discrepancy on page 127 of Panzergruppe West's Operations Journal. December 17, 1944. Multiple entries documenting unauthorized transmissions on command frequencies between 2100 and 0200 hours. Orders that contradicted regimental directives. Hold commands that delayed the advance by nearly 6 hours. The German after-action analysis blamed equipment malfunction. The Allied intelligence report called it unexplained interference. But when the student overlaid the transmission timestamps with Allied unit movements in the same sector, a pattern emerged. Every hold order corresponded exactly with gaps in the German advance. Every rerouted convoy created space for American forces to reposition. Every fuel priority delay bought time for artillery to register firing coordinates. The interference wasn't random, it was tactical. She kept digging. 3 months later, she found a personnel record. Corporal Thomas Lyle, U.S. Army Signal Corps. I am a fluent German speaker. Assigned to the 99th Infantry Division, Communications Section. Present in the Malmedy sector on December 17, 1944. No commendations. No disciplinary actions. No official record of anything unusual. But in a routine after-action interview conducted in February 1945, a document she found misfiled in a depot archive, Lyle had been asked a standard question. Did you observe any enemy radio activity during the period of December 16th, 18th? His answer, typed in faded ink on a 70-year-old form. Yes, observed significant communication confusion on enemy frequencies. Appeared to be internal coordination failure. The interviewer hadn't followed up, but the student noticed something. Lyle hadn't said he monitored enemy frequencies. He'd said he observed activity on them, the kind of phrasing someone might use if they couldn't say more without incriminating themselves. She tracked down Lyle's family in 2005. Thomas Lyle died in 1989. His wife, Mary, had passed 2 years later, but his daughter, Susan Lyle Hoffman, a retired librarian in Madison, agreed to an interview. The student asked if her father had ever talked about the war. Not much, Susan said. He didn't like talking about it, said he mostly fixed radios. Did he ever mention speaking German, using it during the war? Susan paused. Once. I was maybe 12. We were listening to the radio, some program in German, and I asked if he understood it. He said yes. Then he got very quiet and turned it off. Did he say why? No, but my mother told me later that he used to have nightmares. Always the same. He'd wake up speaking German, saying the same phrases over and over. Halten Sie die Linie. Warten auf Befehle. Hold the line. Await orders. She said it stopped in the 1960s, but for years he'd wake up like he was still there, still saying it. The student published her findings in 2007. The paper was titled, The Ghost Transmission, Unauthorized Psychological Warfare in the Battle of the Bulge. It documented the timeline, the transmissions, the effect on German operations, the circumstantial evidence pointing to Corporal Thomas Lyle. It concluded that one American soldier, acting without orders, without authorization, without support, had likely impersonated a Wehrmacht officer and stalled a Panzer division's advance for 6 critical hours. The paper won academic awards. Military historians called it a remarkable case study in individual initiative. The Army reviewed the findings but issued no official statement. There was no documentation to confirm Lyle's actions, no surviving witnesses, no physical evidence, just logs, timestamps, and the fading memory of a man who never claimed credit. In 2008, the U.S. Army Signal Corps Association erected a small plaque at Fort Gordon, Georgia. It lists the names of signals personnel who demonstrated exceptional ingenuity under combat conditions. Corporal Thomas Lyle's name is on it. One line among many. No details, no explanation, just a name, a rank, and a date. December 17, 1944. Here's what we know. On the night of December 17, 1944, a German Panzer division advancing through the Ardennes forest inexplicably halted for 6 hours, citing communication confusion and contradictory orders. No Allied deception operation was planned. No jamming equipment was deployed. But somewhere, in the frozen dark, someone spoke, and an army listened. Thomas Lyle never fired a shot, but for 6 hours, his voice was more powerful than artillery. He didn't stop the Battle of the Bulge, but he bought time. Time for men to regroup, for guns to reposition, for a broken line to hold just long enough. And when it was over, he walked away, back into the anonymous mass of soldiers who did their duty and went home. The Germans called it equipment failure. The Allies called it luck, but it wasn't either. It was one man, one radio, and the kind of courage that doesn't come with medals. The courage to break the rules when the rules no longer make sense. There's a question that haunts every war story. What separates genius from insubordination? When does breaking the rules become heroism? And when does it become treason? The answer, usually, is the outcome. If Thomas Lyle's gambit had failed, if a German officer had demanded authentication codes he couldn't provide, if they'd traced his signal, if his deception had been discovered, he would have died in that barn, shot as a spy, buried in an unmarked grave. No trial, no appeal, just execution. The regulations he violated weren't arbitrary. They existed for reason. Unauthorized transmissions could compromise operational security. Impersonating enemy officers could provoke retaliation against prisoners of war. Breaking radio silence could reveal Allied positions. Every rule Lyle broke that night had been written in blood. But Lyle understood something his commanders, sitting in heated command posts 200 miles away, did not. Rules are designed for situations where the system still functions. And on December 17, 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the system had failed. The military doesn't celebrate soldiers like Thomas Lyle. Not openly, not officially, because celebrating him means acknowledging an uncomfortable truth, that sometimes survival requires disobedience, that the chain of command can break, that a corporal in a barn might see the battlefield more clearly than a general studying maps. Lyle's story challenges the fundamental structure of military hierarchy. It suggests that authority is not always right, that orders are not always wise, that the rule book is not always relevant. These are dangerous ideas in an institution built on obedience. So the Army did what institutions do when confronted with uncomfortable excellence. They filed it away, classified it, let it fade into footnotes and declassified logs that nobody would read for 60 years. Not out of malice, out of necessity. Because if every soldier started making Thomas Lyle's choice, citing for themselves when the rules no longer applied, the entire structure would collapse. But here's the paradox. If no one ever made that choice, wars would be lost by men following outdated orders into certain death. Lyle never sought recognition. He never filed a report, never told his story, never claimed the credit that, arguably, he'd earned. Why? Maybe he knew what would happen if he did. Court-martial, investigation. The machinery of military justice grinding him down for doing what had to be done. Or maybe, and this seems more likely given the man, he simply didn't think it mattered. He'd done his job. The line had held. Men had lived who otherwise would have died. That was enough. There's a kind of heroism in that silence, the kind that doesn't need parades or medals, the kind that measures success in lives saved rather than glory earned, the kind that goes home, opens a hardware store, and never mentions it again. We tell war stories for a reason, not to glorify violence, not to romanticize combat, but to remember that wars are won by people, individuals making impossible choices in impossible circumstances with incomplete information and no guarantee of survival. Thomas Lyle's story matters because it reminds us that power doesn't always come from rank or firepower. Sometimes it comes from knowledge, from language, from the ability to think clearly when everything is falling apart. He never fired a shot, but he stopped an army. Not with force, with words. There's a barn outside Malmedy, or what's left of one. The roof collapsed decades ago. The walls are mostly gone. It's marked on no map, memorialized by no plaque. If you stood there today, you'd see nothing but overgrown fields and forest reclaiming the space where men once fought and died. But on December 17, 1944, that barn was the most important place in the European theater. Because inside it, a corporal with a stolen radio made a choice that changed the course of a battle. And then he walked away, into the snow, into the anonymous mass of soldiers, into history's silence, where the best of them often remain. Thomas Lyle died in 1989. His obituary in the Madison newspaper mentioned that he was a World War II veteran, a hardware store owner, and a devoted husband and father. It didn't mention what he'd done in a frozen barn 45 years earlier, because he'd never told anyone. Not for glory, not for recognition, just for the men who needed 6 more hours. And got them. The bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them, glory and danger alike, and yet notwithstanding, go out to meet it. Thucydides. In every war there are 2 battles. The one that gets recorded, the one with maps and dates and casualty figures. The one historians argue about, filmmakers dramatize, and textbooks summarize in 3 paragraphs. And then there's the other one, the battle fought in moments no one witnessed, in decisions made alone. In risks taken without orders, without backup, without any guarantee that anyone will ever know. This is the invisible war. It's fought by medics who run into fire to drag out the wounded, by engineers who defuse bombs with shaking hands, by pilots who nurse crippled aircraft home, by intelligence officers who piece together fragments of intercepted code at 3 in the morning, by radio operators who speak when they're supposed to stay silent. These stories don't make it into the history books. Not because they don't matter, but because they happen in the spaces between official records, in the gaps where documentation fails and memory fades. Thomas Lyle's story survived by accident, a graduate student's curiosity, a footnote in a German operations log, a daughter who remembered her father's nightmares. How many others didn't? How many soldiers made impossible choices that changed outcomes in ways no one ever traced? How many acts of improvised genius, desperate courage, or defiant creativity disappeared into the fog of war? We'll never know. Because they did what Lyle did, their job, quietly, without seeking credit, and then went home. There's a tendency to think of warfare in terms of grand strategy, generals moving pins on maps, politicians making declarations, battles won by superior numbers or better technology. But wars are won in barns, in frozen trenches and ruined buildings and radio shacks and field hospitals, by people who see what needs to be done and do it, even when it's forbidden, even when it's terrifying, even when no one will ever know, especially when no one will ever know. Thomas Lyle bought 6 hours, that's all. 6 hours in a battle that lasted 6 weeks, in a war that lasted 6 years. It doesn't sound like much, but in those 6 hours, artillery batteries repositioned, infantry companies regrouped, tank destroyers moved into ambush positions, communication networks came back online. And when the German Panzers finally advanced, they didn't find a broken line. They found Americans waiting for them. 6 hours. The difference between collapse and resistance, between retreat and stand. between lost and held. You won't find Thomas Lyle's name in most history books. There's no statue, no bridge named after him, no dramatic movie depicting his night in the barn, just a line on a plaque at Fort Gordon, a name among many, which is exactly what he would have wanted, because the invisible war isn't fought for recognition. It's fought because someone has to, and sometimes, just sometimes, that someone is a corporal with a stolen radio, speaking perfect German into the dark, buying time, saving lives, then walking away. This is how wars are really won, not with speeches or strategies, but with moments, decisions, voices, and the courage to use them when it matters most. For all the soldiers whose names we'll never know, who did what needed doing, and asked for nothing in return. December 17th, 2024, 80 years to the day. In the forests outside Malmedy, Belgium, a small group gathered at a roadside memorial. Local historians, a few American veterans from later wars, a Belgian schoolteacher with her students. They came to remember the Battle of the Bulge, the soldiers who fought, the ground that was lost and retaken. The names are carved into stone. Thomas Lyle's name wasn't among them, but his granddaughter was there. Sarah Hoffman had brought something with her. A photograph, faded, black and white, taken in 1945, somewhere in Germany, after the war had ended. It showed a young man in an army uniform, thin and tired, standing beside a radio truck. He wasn't smiling. I wasn't posing. Just standing there, hands in his pockets, looking at something outside the frame. On the back, in her grandfather's handwriting, Germany, May 1945, ready to go home. That was all. No mention of the Ardennes, no mention of the barn, no mention of the night he broke every rule and spoke with a voice that stopped an army. Just a man ready to go home. Sarah had read the dissertation, the one that pieced together what her grandfather had done. The German logs, the Allied reports, the 6-hour gap that no one could explain. She'd read her mother's memories, the nightmares, the German phrases spoken in sleep, the silence that followed any question about the war. And she'd found one more thing, a letter, tucked inside her grandfather's Bible, discovered after he died. Never mailed, never addressed to anyone. Just words, written in his careful handwriting. Dated December 1944. I don't know if what I did was right. They tell us there are rules, protocols, chains of command, and I broke all of them. I keep thinking about the men I might have saved, the ones who got those 6 hours to dig in, to reposition, to survive. But I also think about the Germans I lied to, young men probably, following orders like I was supposed to, waiting in the cold because a voice they trusted told them to wait. Some of them died when our artillery found them. Some probably died later, in battles they wouldn't have reached if I hadn't delayed them. I don't know if that makes me a hero or something else. All I know is that at that moment, I had to choose between the rules and the men, between protocol and survival, between silence and action. I chose it. I'd choose the same way again. But I'll carry the weight of it for the rest of my life. Sarah read those words aloud to the small gathering. Her voice caught twice, once at I don't know if what I did was right, and again at I'll carry the weight of it for the rest of my life. When she finished, there was silence, just the wind through the trees, the same trees that had stood here 80 years ago when the snow fell thick and Panzer engines growled in the dark. The Belgian schoolteacher spoke first. "Your grandfather saved lives," she said quietly. "Perhaps hundreds, perhaps more. The ripple of 6 hours. We cannot measure it." "But he never claimed it," Sarah said. "He never told anyone." "Perhaps," said an elderly American veteran in the group. "That's exactly why it mattered." He stepped forward, leaning on a cane, his jacket bearing the insignia of the 101st Airborne. "I wasn't here in '44. I was in Vietnam. Different war, different enemy. But I knew men like your grandfather, the ones who did what needed doing and never spoke of it. They didn't need medals, didn't need recognition. They measured success differently. How? Sarah asked. The old soldier smiled, sad and knowing. By who made it home? Sarah placed the photograph against the memorial stone. A young man in an army uniform, thin and tired, ready to go home. Beside it, she placed something else. A small brass plate privately commissioned. No official approval, no military authorization. Just 11 words. Corporal Thomas Lyle, U.S. Army Signal Corps. He spoke when silence meant death. The students took photographs. The historians made notes. The wind kept blowing through the trees. And somewhere, in the space between history and memory, between recognition and anonymity, Thomas Lyle's story joined the countless others that will never be fully known. The medic who saved one more life, the pilot who brought his crew home, the engineer who cleared one more mine, the rifleman who held one more position, the radio operator who bought 6 hours. That night, back in her hotel room, Sarah wrote an email to the Army Signal Corps Museum. She attached the photograph, the letter, the research. She asked if there was any way to officially recognize what her grandfather had done. The response came 3 weeks later. Thank you for sharing your grandfather's story. Unfortunately, without official documentation or surviving witnesses, we cannot verify the events described. However, we would be honored to include Corporal Lyle's photograph and service record in our archives as an example of the resourcefulness and courage demonstrated by Signals personnel during World War II. It wasn't a medal, it wasn't official recognition, but it was something. A photograph in an archive, a story preserved, a name remembered. And maybe that's enough, because Thomas Lyle didn't need the Army to validate what he'd done. He'd already received the only confirmation that mattered. The sound of American artillery firing coordinated salvos at 0151 hours on December 18, 1944. The proof that the line had held, that the system had rebuilt itself, that the 6 hours had been enough. Wars are not won by individuals. They're won by millions, by nations mobilized, industries retooled, strategies coordinated across continents. But within that vast machinery, there are moments when everything hinges on one person, one choice, one voice, one transmission that changes everything. This is the story of one of those moments, and of the man who made it. Not for glory, not for recognition, not even for certainty that he was right, but because someone had to, and he was there, with a radio and the courage to speak. In the barn outside Malmedy, there is only silence now. The walls have fallen, the roof is gone, the radio is dust and rust buried somewhere beneath decades of soil and snow. But if you stand there on a cold December night, when the wind blows through the pines and the stars are bright overhead, you might imagine, just for a moment, what it sounded like. A voice in the darkness. Calm. Authoritative. Speaking perfect German. Halten Sie die Linie. Warten auf neue Befehle. Hold the line. Await new orders. Words that stopped an army. Spoken by a man the army never knew. Until now. In memory of all who served in silence. All who acted when action was forbidden. All who chose courage over comfort. All who spoke when it mattered most. And especially those whose names we will never know. They were there. They did what needed doing. That is enough. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. Ambrose Redmoon.